Tonight, another row over Irish language signs, calls for violence against MPs and controversy over tributes to IRA members. Sometimes it's hard to believe it's 2025. We'll ask three of the Stormont parties why the current mood seems to be focused more on looking back than looking forward. And remember this?
There is nothing which says in the Good Friday Agreement that there must be reconciliation first. There's no precondition.
We don't think it's possible to say, OK, reconciliation is now done, we move on to the next phase. We think you address the challenges that hold this society back, which are sectarianism, inequality and, yes, the border.
Has the debate within nationalism shifted on the need for reconciliation to come before or after reunification? Hello, don't just take our word for it. Here are some of the stories that have been in the headlines over the last few months, and you'll notice a theme.
All of those issues are creating for us a view that you're not being transparent. You go into the chamber, there's bluster, there's belligerence, there's insulting people who ask questions, when what we're looking for is honesty, integrity and transparency. We're not getting that.
I find it a bit rich coming from Sinn Féin. About honesty, integrity, transparency. To just go read some of the reports around things debated in the Assembly about your party and then come back to me to talk about honesty, integrity.
This is a focus on a symbolic week for the Infrastructure Minister, questions that she still has not answered. And of course we will be taking a look at all of the detail of this. If it is a controversial or significant decision, it ought to be brought to the Executive for consideration and agreement.
This is far from the first time that the Irish language has been used as a political football, and that progress has been prevented by the actions of political parties and activists here.
How quick has the Sinn Féin West Belfast member been to condemn the actions of NECAP? The chance of kill your MP? No comment from Mr Becker in that regard. Maybe not surprising, maybe a tad embarrassing, because it was Sinn Féin's party policy to target MPs and kill them in this country for many years. We take no lectures from the party opposite.
We're in the space now of moral hysteria and moral outrage, and you've a band being held to a higher moral account than politicians who are ignoring international law. Children are starving to death, and we're spending 6 or 7 days speaking about NECAP.
I see a front page headline in the Irish News today about senior DUP politicians who were within hours of the Pope dying at a Loyal Order parade in Lisburn, where a band mocked the Pope by playing No Pope in Rome, a song which you'll probably be familiar with the lyrics of it. They envisage a world extinguished, where Catholicism has been extinguished. Why is that not being talked about?
To honour his legacy is to reopen the wounds of the past. For the innocent victims of the provisional IRA and their families, that is not distant history. It is lived pain. It's the empty chair at the dinner table. The First Minister's attendance in Twinbrook on Sunday was a willful decision to reopen that hurt.
Just a reminder of some of the flashpoints over the past few weeks. Let's tease out some of the issues now with Stormont's opposition leader Matthew O'Toole from the SDLP, the Alliance Party's Owen Tennyson and the DUP MLA Philip Brett. Sinn Féin, by the way, and the Ulster Unionist Party were invited to take part in the programme tonight, but we were told none of their MLAs or MPs were available. So welcome to the three of you who are here, and thank you for making time to join us. Philip Brett, first of all, when you watch that montage, that's more than the cut and thrust of normal political debate. Do you accept that?
Well, I think the politics is passionate. The Assembly is a debating chamber, Mark, and parties were elected on manifestos, so there is a clear energy and intensity for politicians to speak up on the issues that matter to them. But I would disagree.
There's mudslinging there, though.
But I would disagree with the intro to say that the issues that were raised were sectarian. The issue is that our party has raised in relation to concerns about NECAP. We're not just by the DUP, both the Alliance Party and the SDLP raised those concerns too. So I don't think it was a sectarian issue that was raised. We raised the issue of the First Minister's attendance at the erection of the Bobby Sands statue. It was not an issue of sectarianism, it was an issue of her glorifying terrorism. So I disagree that these are issues of sectarianism.
But what happened to the DUP and Sinn Féin disagreeing agreeably? Because that's what we were told last February was going to be the way of it. And that montage shows that seems to have dried up that idea.
Well, four-party executive, we work together on important issues. We work together across the Assembly chamber, but that's not going to dilute our requirement and our want to stand up for the people of Northern Ireland who voted for us on the issues that matter to them. OK. I'm going to quote a line from Emma Little-Pengelly's mission statement from Stormont's restoration back in February last year, and you can tell me what you think she meant. So she was talking about making Northern Ireland the flourishing and thriving place it can be, and here's what she said. We will succeed only by walking that path side by side, not by dismissing and demeaning each other's concerns. There can be no dominating of one over the other. Rather, there must be a new approach of recognising the concerns of each other and finding solutions together. Whatever happened to those lofty ideals? Well, there are solutions that are being found working together. We had a programme for government, a budget that has been agreed in recent weeks, and those are the issues that I believe that the people of Northern Ireland are interested in. But what that doesn't take away from, Mark, is when the First Minister or members of her party, or indeed any other political party, step beyond the bounds of politics. It's our responsibility as political leaders to call them out for doing that, and this party and I will never shy away from doing that.
Well, the Irish News reports today that you attended a loyalist band parade during which an offensive anti-Catholic anthem was played and sung by spectators. Do you know, were you present when that tune was sung?
Well, if you had went on and read the rest of the article,
the
article makes clear that the journalist made no attempt to contact me to ask if I was there when it took place.
So that's why I'm asking you now.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer that, Mark. Secondly, I want to pay tribute to the organisers of that parade who have brought thousands of people onto the streets. But I want to be very clear, like my party leader was last week, apologies, that any song that demeans anyone, attacks anyone's religion or infers sectarianism in any way is totally wrong. It was a small minority who partook in that, but those who did took away from a great event, but they should be called out for doing it. And
OK, so well, you called that a wonderful occasion afterwards on Facebook, but no Pope of Rome was played. You say you weren't aware of it at the time. You absolutely clearly now saying on the record, inappropriate for that tune to be played, inappropriate as well, presumably for the Billy Boys, which includes the line up to our knees in Fenian blood, to be played. So I'm wondering, should DUP elected representatives say, we will not go to these events unless or until we receive guarantees from the bands participating that they won't play tunes like that? That'd be simple enough, would it not?
So, Mark, thousands of people attend these parades, thousands of people take part in these parades, and a small minority of people engage in unacceptable behaviour. Last weekend at a football match, we had 25,000 people spectating and enjoying it on the streets. A few of those engaged in sectarian activity. Well, I'm not going to say that every Cliftonville fan or every fan of any other team is sectarian by the actions of a minority. The actions that took place of playing that song were completely wrong. My party leader made that clear last week. I made that clear tonight, but that's not going to step away from supporting events that bring together people on.
But there are no consequences for those bands. That's the point. I mean, nobody does anything about it. They'll play those tunes the next time, and there'll be DUP representatives there as well. They might come onto a programme like this and condemn it, but those songs are still sung, and they're deeply offensive to a lot of people.
And that's why I'm saying they are completely wrong. I'm a huge supporter of the band scene in Northern Ireland, and my message to them is that those songs should not be played because it detracts from the great role that they play right across Northern Ireland.
OK, well, Matthew O'Toole, Philip Brett couldn't be clearer about that. It's wrong that those songs are played and the people responsible for it should be called out. Does that help maybe just dissipate a little bit of tension in the air that montage referred to at the beginning of the programme?
Look, Philip has addressed a specific issue and a specific event. I think people were fairly shocked to see some of the reports around what happened at those parades. But I also want to take a step back, because what that montage was about this sense that our politics, devolved government, which was down for years, has been down for half of the past decade, has sort of run out of steam. And partly it's run out of steam because government executive ministers, particularly those led by Sinn Féin and the DUP, have kind of run out of energy in terms of delivery. There is complete inaction, frankly, at the minute from the executive. So in the context of inaction, they're moving towards distraction, and distraction is having rows over things. Now, individually, all of these are important things. It is really important that we call out sectarianism. It's really important that whenever there's a band playing No Pope of Rome, that is called out. It's really important that we reflect on irresponsible statements made by people in the public eye. It's important that we take our responsibilities as public leaders in terms of attending commemorations. All those things are true, but the problem is it completely takes over and defines our politics, and frankly, people are sick of it.
Well, I wonder why you think the parties are doing that. You've said it's distraction rather than, or to cover for inaction. Do you think those two parties are looking over their notional shoulders? Maybe Sinn Féin at its base doesn't want to get too far ahead of its base, so it needs to be very careful. The DUP looking over its shoulder at the TUV, doesn't want to get away from itself, wants to make sure that it can bring as much of unionism with it as it can. Is that what this is about?
It's definitely true that there has been an incentive in the past for those two parties to fight with one another, even though they're in government. I don't think that's a big revelation.
Yeah, but it's not what Emma Little Pengelly said was going to happen.
No, it's not what Emma Little Pengelly said would happen. Look, I recognise that it's difficult. It's clearly Sinn Féin and the DUP have different constitutional perspectives, and they have different alignments on other ideological issues. But the fundamental point is those parties took office last year. They hold power. We have a public service crisis. We have a crisis with our water infrastructure. We have a crisis in terms of poverty levels in Northern Ireland. Those issues are worse, by the way, than they are in lots of parts of Europe, let alone these islands. We were promised those issues were going to be focused on. That was going to be the priority. In a few weeks' time, lots of kids in this part of the world, I still call them kids, people who are younger than me, but people aged about 21 and 22 are going to be graduating from Ulster and Queen's, and they're going to be thinking about where they use their talent and whether they stay here, go across the water, or maybe go to Australia or Canada. And we're trying to inspire them about life here. When they turn on their TVs or pick up their phones, what they're confronted with constantly is politics as a never-ending old firm game here. And frankly, it really, really isn't good enough. And part of our job is to call it out and remind people that, yes, it's legitimate to talk about individual issues. Yes, it's important to call out and challenge sectarianism. We do that all the time, but it can't be the defining part of our day-to-day political life.
Right, Owen Tennyson, your party is in the coalition at Stormont with the DUP and Sinn Féin. What's your assessment of what's actually motivating what we've seen recently, which is a sort of a sharpness to exchanges, a bitterness perhaps on the public stage that wasn't evident 12 or 14 months ago?
Well, I think if we reflect on the past number of weeks, Mark, if double standards and selective condemnation were an Olympic sport, then there are a number of DUP and Sinn Féin MLAs who would be in a dead heat for gold. And the losers in all of that are the people of Northern Ireland. What people want us to be focused on is the future. They want us to be here tonight debating things like the health service and the cost of living. And instead what we're seeing, as Matthew rightly said, is distraction from those issues. And I think that is partially because delivery from some ministers in the executive has been slower than certainly I would like to see. Because, as I have said many times, there are inherent vetoes within the Assembly and the Executive. The Assembly and Executive may be there, but there are still blockages within the Executive that I think is adding to tensions and slowing down delivery. And so for me, fundamentally, this comes back to the issue of reform of our institutions. It's not good enough that government is there and that MLAs are traipsing into the chamber to trade blows about the latest provocation or poke in the eye.
You keep bringing up, you and other people in Alliance keep bringing up this issue of the reform of the Stormont institutions. And I'm afraid I keep saying back to you, it's not going anywhere because, DUP and Sinn Féin aren't interested, the Irish government and British government aren't interested, so you can talk about it all you like. But in the short term, it's not going anywhere.
In the short term, perhaps not, but there is progress. The Assembly Executive and Review Committee has launched a call for evidence, for example, to look at potential reform proposals, and we're continuing to push very strongly with the UK and Irish governments. Because if we reflect, Mark, issues like the ones in your montage, or issues that have presented themselves over the past year in terms of changes of leadership within parties or disputes within the executive over Irish language and other things, have upended previous executives. And I'm not saying we're anywhere near that point yet, But I do worry that if these structural issues are not addressed, relationships could deteriorate.
Could we slide in that direction?
That is always a risk. I mean, anyone who observes Northern Ireland politics, even from a distance, knows that the institutions are as stable today as they were the day before they last collapsed. So we can't take stability of the Assembly and the Executive
Because events can derail things. We've seen that in the past.
Of course it can, and that requires two things. It requires political leadership to ensure that there are good relationships around that executive table. That means people shouldn't be going out of their way to provoke and defend sections of our community in the way that I think the DUP and Sinn Féin have. But we also then need to have that structural conversation to copperfasten the institutions and ensure them against that kind of behaviour.
Right, that's interesting. So you brought up the issue of political leadership, and I want to talk about that. And I mean, I should say that, and you will, I hope, all agree with me that week after week on this programme and in Sunday Politics and on our Red Lines podcast, we deal with policy issues as well where they are relevant. I just felt at the moment that this is an issue that needs to be aired in the public square. I want to talk to you, Philip, just about that notion of political leadership. It seems that there are a lot of politicians who are very quick to call out things they don't like, that they're offended by, and ignore or choose not to see the things that could perhaps balance a bit of that out. And if you look back to April, for example, the First Minister attended her first Easter commemoration in Northern Ireland since taking up office, and Jonathan Buckley, your colleague, criticised her attendance, calling it a calculated insult to victims and a shameful celebration of terrorism. During her term, she has also attended the Queen's funeral, the King's coronation, and laid a wreath at the Cenotaph on Remembrance Sunday. Did you miss that?
No, I didn't miss that, but what also I didn't miss today, Mark, was the attempt by the First Minister to compare her attendance at the unveiling of a statue to a convicted terrorist to her attending a service for VE Day, and said that they were both comparable. I want to be very clear, because I think a huge amount of people on Northern Ireland will be completely dumbfounded by the remarks that the First Minister
She said she is a First Minister for all, and she was at pains in the past to point out that means all. All. She wants to reach out to unions, but she also wants to be a First Minister for Republicans. And look, you're never going to agree with her attending the unveiling of a statue to Bobby Sands, and I don't expect she would imagine that you would ever support that. She's just making a point. She said, I have had a very busy day on Sunday. She went to the unveiling of that statue to Bobby Sands, and she went on to a church service with the Deputy First Minister marking the 80th anniversary of VE Day. She's not saying they're the same. She's just making a point. She did two things that are very different and that ought to actually make different people in different political constituencies aware of the fact that she's trying, to some extent, to reach out to them.
Well, the VE Day celebrations, Mark, don't belong to any particular community here in Northern Ireland.
And she was there.
And she was there, and she should have been there as the joint head of government here in Northern Ireland. Thousands and thousands of people from all backgrounds and none sacrificed their lives.
And she was there. And she would say she accepts that. And she was there. So can the DUP say then, Philip Brett, that it has reciprocated those actions taken by the First Minister, like, for example, attending the Queen's funeral and the King's coronation? Because we've got a sports minister in Gordon Lyons, member of your party, who's yet to attend a Gaelic match. He's also the Minister responsible for culture, who's threatening legal action over Irish language signs. Where is the reciprocation?
Well, I think you'll recall, Mark, and I think I was on this programme a few days after the Assembly returned. One of the first engagements that the Deputy First Minister undertook was a joint visit with the First Minister to West Belfast to engage directly herself in GAA, because we as a party recognise that right across Northern Ireland that's an important cultural aspect for many of our friends and for our neighbours. And we support
Gordon Lyons has attended more tennis matches in Paris than GAA games in Northern Ireland.
And Gordon Lyons was at an event in Randallstown supporting the GAA as well. The Minister has met and will meet again.
I think that was an event for children, wasn't it?
They still play GAA, Mark. Yeah. So he is a Minister for Sport. Our leader within the Assembly as Deputy First Minister attended. So I think, Mark, we have a clear record on the issue.
Does the DUP have clear enough record on the issue as far as you're concerned within the SDLP?
The GAA game, I think that's fairly obvious. But I think there's a bigger question here, which is what's the purpose of politics and devolved politics? Ultimately, whatever your constitutional view, it has to be about delivering for people, delivering governance, delivering people better public services and improving their lives. The problem is what we've seen with the executive is, frankly, an extraordinarily listless programme for government, absent of targets, no clear strategy or plan to deal with the urgent challenges in our public services, very, very little sense of actual purpose or driving forward effort to improve things for people. Lots of photo ops, lots of waffle, lots of platitudes, and all of those things are in their own way welcome. But the problem is, if you don't have a real driving purpose to improve people's lives, then what you fall back on is the same old stuff, the same old story, as it were, the same old blues tune, to quote that poem from Derek Mahan, simply picking at the old scabs, getting on one another's nerves, and frankly, sham fights. And all of that, I think, fails people.
Just finally, Owen Tennyson, do you worry that issues like, for example, Irish language in Casement Park could derail the devolution settlement? And if it goes down again, you know, there are people who have said, that's it, it's done. It's not going to come back after that.
There is always a risk, Mark. I mean, the Assembly and Executive has come down over less, but I do want to say that reconciliation is about more than gestures. I fear that much of the work around integrated education, shared housing and dealing with the legacy of our past has actually been neglected, and I would like to see a greater focus from the two largest parties on actually moving forward on those issues if they're serious about building a shared and united community.
Do you also accept, though, that Philip Brett, just finally, we're nearly out of time, Philip Brett has a mandate, he represents people who share his political worldview, and he's entitled to stand by it and defend it in public?
He's entitled to do that, but I'm also conscious that both the First and Deputy First Minister promised when they took up office last year to the people of Northern Ireland that they would work together for everyone to deliver a shared future, and I've seen very little evidence of that over the past number of weeks.
Okay, well, the Executive did agree collectively to take money off integrated education.
No, it didn't.
And to move it elsewhere. So there's a shared executive responsibility, I'm afraid. It's not just...
We voted against the capital
That's an issue for another day, folks. OK, we've got to leave it there. Really interesting conversation. We will return to it, no doubt. But for now, thank you all very much indeed. Now, the conversation around unification on this island and where nationalists place reconciliation in that debate sparked to life again recently when the former SDLP leader Colm Eastwood suggested that some in the Republic are using reconciliation to delay unity. Shortly, we'll debate that with representatives from Ireland's Future and the New Ireland Commission and the Belfast Telegraph's Suzanne Breen. But first, here's a flavour of the discussion when we first debated it, you might remember, last year.
It's not part of the Good Friday Agreement in the sense that the Good Friday Agreement sets no condition for a border poll except that the Secretary of State decides that it is likely to be won, and he is then obliged to hold the border poll. There is nothing which says there must be reconciliation first. Now, our position is we follow the Irish Constitution and the Good Friday Agreement. There is nothing which says in the Good Friday Agreement that there must be reconciliation first. There's no precondition.
I don't think people see this any longer as some sort of head count issue. People are interested in the wider conversation. We genuinely believe that this can be a process of reconciliation, sitting down with people, often on a one-to-one basis or in small groups, asking them about their hopes, asking them about their fears, and getting to the other side of it. So we don't think it's linear. We don't think it's possible to say, OK, reconciliation is now done. We move on to the next phase. We think you address the challenges that hold this society back, which are sectarianism, inequality, and yes, the border, but you have to do them all at the same time.
Well, that was March last year. 14 months later, what has changed? Dr. Brian Feeney from Ireland's Future is back again. Matthew O'Toole is still here. He sits on the SDLP's New Ireland Commission, and Suzanne Breen is, of course, the Belfast Telegraph's political editor. So, welcome to the programme. Matthew O'Toole, let me just start with you. When Claire Hanna sat in the studio last year, she said, you can't have unity without reconciliation. You need to deal with sectarianism, inequality and the border together. Colm Eastwood now says some people are using reconciliation as a way of slowing down unity. Just tell me what's changed.
Well, I'm not sure very much has changed other than time has passed and the argument has moved on, but let me explain why there's a consistency there. I think sometimes there's a slightly false dichotomy that's created about this concept of reconciliation. When we talk about reconciliation, and it's been at the core of our approach to constitutional change, unity in New Ireland the whole way through, what we don't mean is the idea that reconciliation in some abstract sense has to be a precondition for having constitutional change or even having a debate about constitutional change.
But it has to be part of the process.
It has to be a process of reconciliation. Now, that does not mean you don't have you can't have constitutional change. What it means, and it's all set out in this document, which predates, this is a very pithy document available online, which is our principles about building a new Ireland. It sets out how having the conversation about changing Ireland, about building a new Ireland, can in itself be a process of reconciliation. And that's not simply about having two tribes talking to one another. It's certainly not about victory of one tribe or one historical position over another. It's about genuinely moving on from some of the stuff we were talking about before, Mark, living in one long old firm game, talking to one another honestly about the kind of society and the kind of Ireland we want to live in. That is a process of reconciliation. It's not the same thing as saying someone can have a permanent veto on change by saying, I'm not reconciled, so I'm going to stick up a UDA flag, therefore, ergo, we can't have this conversation. So there's a slightly false dichotomy that's created. This has to be a process of reconciliation, but that doesn't mean that you can create a kind of a veto, as it were,
Right, but
by
is it a
saying,
change of
I'm not
tone?
reconciled.
Is that what it is then?
Well, I think what you saw, I've said this in the past, and certainly you mentioned Colum's article recently. I've written many thousands of words on this over the last few years. It's why I'm in politics here, bluntly. Things have changed, not just in the last year, but since particularly 2016. My own life and career has changed. It's why I'm in politics here. I became a politician here in part because I had a previous life where I was working in the UK government during the Brexit process. There is a tendency among some, and yes, it's true, it has been said by some in Dublin, that we can't ever talk about constitutional change because Northern Ireland has to reach some state that is never properly defined before we can have that conversation. I deeply believe in reconciliation, and I believe in the process of reconciliation, but it is important to say that the Good Friday Agreement does not say that it is somehow divisive per se to talk about a constitutional change. It says the two aspirations are equal. Ergo, we need to be able to talk about it, and that isn't in and of itself divisive, and it can be, I believe, a process of reconciliation.
Let's bring Brian Feeney in at this point. You sat in this very studio 14 months ago and you debated with Claire Hanna, and a memorable conversation that was. You're here now tonight to discuss this with Matthew O'Toole and Suzanne Breen as well. Let's cut to the chase. Do you believe that the new Ireland Commission's position, the SDLP's position effectively, has moved over to your territory in Ireland's future?
Yes, it has. And I'm glad they have clarified their position, because in March 2024, when discussing this with Claire Hanna, it was a confused position. And I mean, Matt has clarified that quite well tonight, so I'm glad they have taken a stronger position and clarified where they are. I mean, Colm Eastwood's piece in the Irish Times was quite unequivocal, and it was a rebuttal of Micheál Martin, who is in the process of trying to rewrite the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, Micheál Martin is inventing stuff that isn't in the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, he talks about the Good Friday Agreement contained in a pledge on reconciliation. It did nothing of the kind.
You described Colm Eastwood's article as a powerful attack on the Southern establishment.
Yes.
And if you read, and Colm Eastwood's piece is available online, so if people haven't seen it, they can go and read it for themselves. I mean, are we talking now then about a shift which is about Northern nationalism united versus Southern establishment nationalism? Is that what it boils down to?
It's not as simple as that. In many ways,
I know nothing is simple, but to try to help people feel their way through this, is that part of what we're talking about?
In many ways, it's a Northern nationalism saying to Micheál Martin, you're wrong. And Fine Gael is not taking the same position as him. I mean, Simon Harris is simply saying, well, it's not a priority, I'm not getting involved in this kind of thing. But it's important to refute what Micheál Martin is saying. The Good Friday Agreement was not, as Micheál Martin claims, about reconciliation. The Good Friday Agreement starts by saying that it recognises that Irish people have a right to self-determination, and then creates a democratic mechanism to achieve that. There is no section on reconciliation. There is no council, there is no institution, there is nothing in the Good Friday Agreement which sets up mechanisms for reconciliation.
But you still can't ignore it. Is that not the point?
We're not ignoring it.
Well, you would ignore it, because if you could get a border poll tomorrow, you would frankly embrace a border poll tomorrow, and you wouldn't be too concerned about unionists, would you?
No. You couldn't have it tomorrow. I mean, what we've learned in the last 10 years is you've got to prepare for such eventuality.
Well, isn't that what Micheál Martin's effectively arguing?
No, it is not. He actually quite clearly 3 weeks ago said he was not going to prepare for a border poll. There wasn't going to be one by the end of this decade. He was doing nothing to do it. In fact, last year, the Oireachtas All-Party Committee on Implementing the Good Friday demanded that the Irish government begin preparations immediately. Micheál Martin is refusing to do that. And as I said, that was an all-party report, and there's going to be another one this summer from the Good Friday implementation.
Well, he's going about it a different way. He points towards his Shared Island initiative, and he says that is about uniting people and bringing people north and south together and making actual real change and trying to reconcile people. That's his project.
It isn't. He's trying to avoid...
Well, it is his project.
He is.
You don't like it.
It is his project, but that is not his motive. He is trying to avoid having preparation for a border poll.
Okay.
He's not. He's not asking the British to produce the criteria. He's doing nothing to advance it.
He's just saying the time's not right. He's not saying. I mean, he is. I've interviewed him about this, and he's touchy if you push too hard on him, because I said, "Are you still the leader of the Republican Party?" He said, "Of course I'm still the leader of the Republican Party. Of course I want ultimately to see United Ireland. I just think you have to be careful and sensitive about how you approach that." That's his point. So the timing's not right.
No, that's not his point. He's doing nothing to approach it. He's doing nothing to advance it. He's deliberately delaying as much as he can, and he's putting the cart before the horse. Nowhere in the world has there been the creation of institutions when they wait for reconciliation. Look at anywhere. Divided communities in Belgium, in northern Italy, South Germany, they create institutions, and then they go about those institutions establishing a reconciled society.
Can I ask you a question? I just want to pick up on what Brian has said. It's very interesting. He says he believes that the SDLP and the New Ireland Commission has now moved onto his territory, and that there is a coming together of nationalist thinking in this jurisdiction on this particular issue. And I wonder, is everyone on the New Ireland Commission on board with this? And the reason I ask is because last year, the Reverend Dr. Norman Hamilton, who's a former moderator of the Presbyterian Church, as you know, who sits on the Commission's expert panel, said, and I'll quote him on Good Morning Ulster, "Turning this into a political project where politics comes before relationships is a road to nowhere." Have you checked if he's comfortable with this new approach by the Commission and by the SDLP?
Well, Norman Hamilton sat on an expert panel which met a number of times a few years ago. It hasn't met in a while, so it's not formally
When did it last
constituted
meet?
part. Well, it's not formally part of the New Ireland Commission anymore, so it was a couple of years ago, Mark, but that's a slightly kind of semantic point about the structures. But I do want to come back on the question, because I think sometimes what we end up doing is having a conversation about Northern nationalism talking to itself, or is Micheál Martin in this position? I'm not here to have a pick a fight with anybody to disagree with Brian or Micheál Martin. I'm here to set out my view, the view of the SDLP, and the work that we've done through the New Ireland
Would you take as hard a line on Micheál Martin as Brian Feeney just did?
I probably wouldn't, but then Brian Feeney takes a pretty hard line on the SDLP, so I look forward to Brian's comments.
Brian never misses
probably
hits
be a little
the
bit
wall,
more.
so that's okay.
He certainly doesn't, and that's fair enough, but I've got a slightly different approach and a slightly different job to do.
But you're also frustrated about elements of Micheál Martin's approach.
What I would say about that is that I think it's very important to be careful here. When I talk about reconciliation, sometimes part of the problem is that reconciliation has become a word that is often, we say it, but we don't really define what we mean. It is really profoundly important to me that we talk about it as something which is bound up in empathy and seeing one another as human beings. To go back to Hume's famous maxim about difference being an accident of birth, I think that's really bound up with how we see one another and how we treat one another. The corollary, the next step to that, Mark, is that when we talk to one another about change, we do so on the basis of empathy, seeing one another as human beings. That's at the core of reconciliation.
And I need to say, Micheál Martin's not here. He would say he has a hell of a mandate on this issue because of the Taoiseach in Ireland, and he also cares a great deal about this issue.
He does, and that's why I'm not here to argue with or against Micheál Martin. That's not what this is about at all. And I also think the Shared Island Unit has been an extraordinarily positive development on this island. It's done hugely important work in terms of funding things and bringing groups together. It's not in opposition to anything we're doing. We're hugely supportive of it. Okay. The conversation about change, though, why it's important to talk about the conversation about change and the tone of it is this. What you can't do is say that 1998 was an end point for in terms of history. The world has changed. The UK state has changed. The UK is a poorer, it's a more insecure country. It's outside Europe. We have seen its politics fundamentally change, including in the local elections last week. Yeah. It's not fair to say to people in this part of the UK, if you like, in this part of Ireland, that you can't ever respond to that. You can't ever, as a citizen, think whether you're unionist, nationalist, or don't care, that you can't ever have a conversation about how you might want a different society and a different constitutional setup.
I could just imagine unionists watching this at home.
By the way,
that's absolutely fine. You're entitled to have the conversation, but actually we're not interested in the debate.
Well, I can tell you, I'm happy to tell you about lots of unions who have engaged with me and engaged with the SDLP and the Commission on that, because they do, and they do want to hear from us, and that's what our role is. And I think we have that role to play, possibly more than some other parties.
Okay, Suzanne, I mean, interesting conversation. Matthew says there may have been a slight tonal shift to the Commission's position. Brian says it's much more significant for than that, and that Matthew's worldview has moved over to Brian's worldview. What's your assessment of what's going on here?
Well, I think it's quite clear that Northern Nationalists are more united now than ever, that the Sinn Féin and SDLP positions, yes, there's difference in nuance, but for both parties now, Irish unity is an objective. For the SDLP, for years, for decades, it was just an aspiration. It was something that they professed, but really it was the idea was put up there on a shelf to gather dust, and that has changed. I think Northern Nationalists are generally suspicious of those up here in the unionist community and of the likes of Micheál Martin, who will talk about reconciliation not being advisory or beneficial for Irish unity, but really being a prerequisite. And they see that as an attempt in 2025 to introduce a new veto, much as we had the talk of the need for supermajorities or perhaps the need for losers' consent in a border poll.
Who's using reconciliation, do you think, to slow this process down, if that's what's happening? Is it the Irish government, or is it unionists, or is it both?
I think we increasingly hear it from both, and I think that's a reflection of the fact that the numbers are changing in the north, that the union is less secure than at any time since the Northern Ireland state was founded. And I think nationalists see very much that the rules for the survival of the northern state didn't depend on supermajorities, and it didn't depend on reconciliation, and that now the rules of the game are being changed. I think that's the feeling in the nationalist community. It
is interesting. Just we don't have a lot of time here, but if you talk to people like Pete Shirlow, Lee Reynolds, and we had them on the programme, we went to an event that they held in Coleraine where they were talking about making the case for unionism. They will say that in their view, all this talk about a united Ireland hasn't moved the prospect of Irish unity one step closer in the last 5, 10, 20 years.
I don't think there has been a massive going over the cliff edge for those who support Irish unity, but I think slowly but surely things are changing. They changed, significantly post-Brexit, and I also think that recent studies which show that the South is doing much better than the North in terms of living standards, wages, benefits, life expectancy, shorter waiting lists. I think that those practical benefits of Irish unity are increasingly coming into play with the Catholic middle class, with people who were culturally nationalists but were quite content with the political status quo.
OK, we're nearly out of time. We have about 30 seconds left. I just want to ask you about that first debate that we had tonight. There appear to be tensions between the two big parties at Stormont. How dangerous is that, do you think, for the devolution project?
Well, I do think that the Assembly and the Executive are going to last to the end of the mandate. Certainly the gloss has come off things, but I think that personal relationships between ministers are still good.
OK, well, again, it's a huge subject. We've kind of scratched the surface again. We'll come back to it. Between now and a year's time, everybody has lots more to say, but we will devote more time to it.
One point is this is not just about nationalists, and our whole purpose is to move beyond that, to move beyond those binaries and to reach people who want to talk about a new society in this island.
Well, we're not going to wait a year for the next time. Thanks all very much indeed. That's all we've got time for tonight. Just before we go, quick pointer to the BBC News NI website, where you can now find all of our political programmes in the one place. Just go to bbc.co.uk/newsni and scroll down to find the programmes, or you can, of course, use the BBC News app on your phone. I'll be back at the weekend with Sunday Politics. We'll be discussing health and education for now from all of us. Thanks for watching. Good night.